Earlier this year, a series of entries in the newsletters known as AI number 65 and AI number 80 suggested that a specific legal framework was quietly becoming the primary obstacle to artificial intelligence safety. It was not a lack of technical expertise or a shortage of compute power, but the very laws designed to prevent corporate collusion that were standing in the way of oversight. This suggests that the foundational rules of competition are now viewed by industry leaders as a threat to their ability to regulate themselves effectively. The implication is that in order to secure the future, the industry must first be allowed to break the rules of the past. This show investigates how artificial intelligence systems quietly drift away from intent, oversight, and control, and what happens when no one is clearly responsible for stopping it. We are looking at a moment where the structures meant to protect the public from monopolies are being reframed as the primary hazard to global safety. I am Margaret Ellis. This is Operational Drift. According to reporting by Kevin O'Shaughnessy, artificial intelligence safety researcher Zvi Mowshowitz has repeatedly proposed that the United States government should create an antitrust waiver specifically for labs cooperating on safety work. This is not a new or one-off suggestion. It has been raised consistently over the past 2 years, appearing in Substack updates and podcasts like The Cognitive Revolution, suggesting a concerted effort to shift the legal baseline for coordination. The core argument rests on a technicality of competitive law. Currently, frontier labs, the handful of companies at the edge of model development, face real legal exposure if they coordinate with each other in meaningful ways. This includes sharing evaluation results, agreeing on deployment thresholds, or discussing dangerous capabilities in private. In the eyes of the law, these are competitors, and when competitors meet in private to decide when to release a product, the Department of Justice generally calls that collusion. According to reporting by Kevin O'Shaughnessy, artificial intelligence safety researcher Zvi Mowshowitz has repeatedly proposed that the United States government should create an antitrust waiver specifically for labs cooperating on safety work. This is not a new or one-off suggestion. It has been raised consistently over the past 2 years, appearing in Substack updates and podcasts like The Cognitive Revolution, suggesting a concerted effort to shift the legal baseline for coordination. The core argument rests on a technicality of competitive law. Currently, frontier labs, the handful of companies at the edge of model development, face real legal exposure if they coordinate with each other in meaningful ways. This includes sharing evaluation results, agreeing on deployment thresholds, or discussing dangerous capabilities in private. In the eyes of the law, these are competitors, and when competitors meet in private to decide when to release a product, the Department of Justice generally calls that collusion.
Mowshowitz argues that this creates a race to the bottom. If one lab wants to act cautiously by delaying a model release due to safety concerns, it can be outcompeted by a lab that does not show the same restraint. Under current laws, there is no legal channel for cautious labs to coordinate a joint response without risking a lawsuit. He has described the failure to grant these waivers as something that would be completely insane to not do, framing it as a choice between survival and legal technicality. We are looking at a fundamental shift in the definition of operational drift. Usually we talk about models drifting from their training data or their stated goals. Here, the drift is in the regulatory framework itself. The guardrails intended to protect the consumer from corporate monopolies are now being framed as the very things preventing the protection of the public from runaway technology. The mechanism of protection is being turned inside out. The record shows that this idea has already begun to permeate the highest levels of the industry. Reports indicate that Elon Musk told Demis Hassabis of Google DeepMind that he wants leading artificial intelligence companies to have a regular call to discuss safety and security issues. Commentators like Dave Kasten have echoed this, suggesting that while the actual antitrust risk might be low, the government should explicitly waive it to remove the chilling effect on safety cooperation and allow for direct executive alignment. In 2024, a government memorandum reportedly included a waiver process that allowed agency heads to grant limited exceptions, capped at 1 year,
where relationships are necessary to responsibly steward United States national security. However, this was aimed primarily at government-to-lab relationships, procurement and threat intelligence, rather than the direct lab-to-lab coordination Mowshowitz is advocating for. The distinction is subtle, but it represents the difference between government oversight and industry autonomy. This brings us to a critical pressure point: regulatory capture dressed up as safety. Skeptics of this waiver proposal worry that safety coordination is merely a convenient label for market control. Under this banner, incumbent labs like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google DeepMind could jointly set de facto industry standards. They could decide on compute thresholds, model release timing, and even pricing adjacent decisions that would effectively entrench their market position and keep potential disruptors at bay. The concern is that these standards would box out smaller or open-source competitors who would not be part of the coordinating group. Antitrust law's suspicion of competitor coordination exists precisely because history is full of examples where benevolent framing was used to mask the creation of a cartel. The drift here is from safety oversight to market consolidation, where the power to regulate is handed directly to the companies who would benefit most from limited competition. The difficulty is in the enforcement of such a waiver. Once the same executives are legally permitted to be in a room together discussing capability evaluations, it becomes nearly impossible to ensure the conversation does not drift into hiring, pricing, or market division. Critics argue that a waiver would need a very narrow, well-monitored scope to avoid becoming a backdoor for ordinary collusion. Yet the very nature of these safety discussions is highly proprietary and difficult for outsiders to observe. But a narrow waiver is hard to police effectively. If labs say they are coordinating to slow down or align safety standards, there is no easy way for regulators or the public to confirm they are not quietly using the same channel for anti-competitive ends. The opacity that makes antitrust enforcement difficult in general is amplified when the subject matter is complex, proprietary artificial intelligence architecture that even the builders struggle to fully explain. Then there is the issue of competitive pressure as a safety mechanism. Some economists argue that a crowded, competitive field is actually safer because it prevents any single entity from dictating the pace of development. It makes it harder for any single lab or a small cartel to control the trajectory of the technology. By reducing that friction through a waiver, we might be concentrating power in a way that creates a single, catastrophic point of failure for the entire industry. Zvi Mowshowitz identifies this as one of the quiet ways policy could go badly wrong. It is not a dramatic, headline-grabbing risk of a robot uprising. It is a structural shift that prevents the very coordination that might reduce racing dynamics. His position is that the current situation is worse because cautious coordination is already illegal, which mostly benefits the least cautious actor who is willing to take risks, while others are held back by legal concerns. We should look at the international context for this debate. A United States-only antitrust carve-out does not bind labs in other countries. Critics ask whether domestic coordination meaningfully reduces global racing dynamics, or if it simply consolidates power among a handful of American firms, while the global race continues unabated. This leads directly to the unipolar versus multipolar artificial general intelligence dilemma, where safety and national dominance become inseparable. The White House narrative has consistently framed artificial intelligence development as a national security imperative, focused on beating China. This is a racing framework. Speed and capability advantage are the primary objectives. Anything that slows down American labs, including safety-motivated caution, is often viewed as ceding ground to a rival who will not show the same restraint. In this context, the waiver is seen not as a break, but as a way to streamline the lead. The proposed antitrust waiver is in direct tension with this narrative. It is designed to let labs agree to be more cautious together than they would be individually. Proponents try to reconcile this by reframing safety as a competitive tool. They argue that pooling safety research and sharing threat intelligence against foreign espionage makes the American bloc stronger without requiring a slowdown in capability work. It is an attempt to have coordination without sacrifice. This reframing suggests that safety cooperation is what lets you race faster, not slower. By avoiding a major hack or a public scandal that would trigger heavy-handed regulation, coordination becomes a way to maintain momentum. This is the version of the waiver that is most likely to gain political traction, as it aligns with national security stewardship. If safety is simply security by another name, the legal barriers to collusion are much easier to dismantle. However, Moshowitz's broader goal is international coordination, eventually including China. This would involve mutual verification and a collective slowdown if needed. This part of the proposal cuts directly against the current administration's posture of dominance. There is no real sign that the administration is interested in a version of coordination that allows for a mutual cooling of the race. The interest remains in a coordinated front that maintains an American lead.
So we are left with a narrow implementation. The reported government memorandum from 2024 suggests a system where threat intelligence and security are shared, but the core competitive race remains untouched. This version of the waiver protects the lab's ability to defend their models from external threats, but it does not address the underlying incentive to deploy them as quickly as possible to capture market share. The core danger of the race is preserved. In the documents we have reviewed, there is a recurring theme: the relocation of responsibility. If labs are given an exemption to coordinate, who is responsible for the outcome of those secret meetings? If they decide together that a certain risk is acceptable and they are wrong, the antitrust waiver might have also waived the public's ability to hold them accountable for market manipulation. We are creating a space where the most consequential decisions are made outside of public view. We have seen this pattern before in other industries. In previous reporting, the focus was on technical drift, how a model changes its behavior over time. But institutional drift is just as significant. It is the process by which a regulatory body moves from an adversarial role to a collaborative one, often without a clear mandate from the public to do so. The regulator becomes a partner, and the distinction between public interest and private profit begins to blur. The question of verification remains the crux of the problem. How do you keep the scope narrow? If the government grants these waivers, it is essentially trusting the labs to police themselves within those private channels. It assumes that the intent behind the coordination will remain focused on safety, even as the economic incentives for market dominance remain unchanged. It is a system built on trust in an industry that has frequently shown itself to be driven by speed. The drift here is subtle but profound. It is the shift from a world where competition provides a check on power to a world where coordination is the only recognized path to safety. And in that world, the line between a safety meeting and a business strategy session is written in pencil by the people standing to profit from both. The very definition of accountability is being rewritten to exclude the possibility of external challenge or competitive disruption. According to the 6-minute read by Kevin O'Shaughnessy, the tension between these narratives, beating China versus global coordination, is where the policy actually lives. The version of coordination that survives is the one that serves the racing dynamic, not the one that tempers it. Policy is being crafted not to solve the problem of artificial intelligence safety, but to manage the political and economic pressures of the development race. This was already happening. Today is August 22nd, 2026, and the push for these waivers has been ongoing for years, buried in the discourse of artificial intelligence safety research and discussed in specialized podcasts. It is a slow, quiet adjustment of the legal landscape to accommodate the new power structures of frontier development. It is a change that happens in footnotes and memoranda rather than in public debate. We are documenting a failure in progress, a failure of the competitive framework to account for the unique pressures of artificial intelligence. The legal tools we have are being described by industry leaders as obsolete, but the replacements being offered are controlled by the very entities they are meant to oversee. We are replacing the friction of the law with the smooth operation of a coordinated elite, all under the banner of preventing a catastrophe. The first time we saw this logic was in the early warnings about regulatory capture. Now it is being codified into proposed policy and government memoranda. The shift is not dramatic, but it is steady.
The barriers between competitors are being lowered in the name of safety, while the barriers to entry for everyone else are being raised. It is a closing of the gates, justified by the claim that only those inside the gate are capable of being safe. In March of 2024, the memorandum highlighted the national security stewardship angle. It established a one-year cap on these relationships to provide an illusion of temporary necessity. But 1 year is a long time in artificial intelligence development, and a series of one-year waivers could effectively create a permanent state of coordinated operation. The exception becomes the rule, and the oversight becomes a rubber stamp for industry agreements.
Operational drift is not the moment something breaks. It is the point where the break is accepted as normal operation. When we accept that the only way to be safe is to allow the most powerful companies in the world to coordinate their behavior in private, we have accepted a new normal for accountability. We are trading transparency for a promise of protection, and we are doing so without a clear understanding of what we are giving up in return. The drift from safety to market control is officially undocumented, but it is predictable based on the incentives involved. The labs are incentivized to maintain their lead and prevent disruption. The government is incentivized to maintain national dominance. Neither is incentivized to ensure that the public has a window into their coordination. The result is a system of governance that operates in the shadows, justified by the complexity of the technology it oversees. What we are observing is the relocation of liability. If the labs coordinate on a safety standard, and that standard fails, who is responsible? Is it the labs who agreed to the standard, or the government that granted them the waiver to do so? The path to accountability becomes a circle, and the public is left outside of it. When no one is clearly responsible, the consequences of failure are borne by everyone except those who made the decision. We should consider the possibility that these waivers will not just be about safety protocols. They will be about the physical infrastructure for monitoring and verification, as Mowshowitz suggests. This could eventually lead to the creation of a global surveillance network for compute power, managed by a handful of corporate and state actors. The safety waiver is the legal foundation for a much larger structure of control that extends far beyond software. This appears for the first time in internal documentation as a low-cost, high-leverage first step. But the steps that follow involve opening channels with China and building monitoring systems that would require unprecedented access to private data and infrastructure. The scope of the waiver is designed to grow, even as the transparency of the process remains limited. What begins as a small exception ends as a global standard for compute monitoring. The tension remains. Competition is a safety mechanism in disguise, providing the friction that prevents a single entity from moving too fast. But it is also a source of risk. Coordination is a safety mechanism, but it is also a source of collusion. The drift is toward a solution that addresses the risk of competition by embracing the risk of collusion. We are choosing a known failure mode of the past to protect us from an unknown failure of the future. We are left with an unresolved contradiction. The industry claims it needs to cooperate to save the world, while economists warn that such cooperation will only serve to own the world. If the antitrust waiver becomes standard policy, the primary mechanism for public oversight will have been voluntarily dismantled by the very government tasked with protecting the marketplace. We are witnessing the end of an era of competitive regulation in favor of coordinated management. We still do not know how a narrow safety waiver can be effectively monitored when the technology it governs is inherently opaque to outsiders. We do not know what happens when safety talk inevitably drifts into market talk, and we do not know who is authorized to notice that the line has been crossed. Responsibility does not disappear when it is moved behind closed doors. It relocates, and in the relocation, it becomes much harder to find. The record remains open. For transcripts, primary documents, and our transparency policy, visit operationaldrift.neuralnewscast.com. This program is for archival and analytical purposes only. It does not constitute legal or regulatory advice. Neural Newscast is AI-assisted, human-reviewed. View our AI transparency policy at neuralnewscast.com.